So, welcome to the second in our series of informal conversations between colleagues at DaRE, the Centre for Dance Research at Coventry University. The first of our conversations came about in response to an article in The Guardian called "Touch Saved Me from Loneliness, What Will We Become Without It?", written by V, formerly known as Eve Ensler. So in this, the second of our conversations, we have Sara Reed, Susanne Foellmer, and Emma Meehan, who will be talking in more, extending the conversation, partly in response to the first conversation and also in response to the article. And we expect that in this conversation, we may draw a bit more on practice and research and the impact of touch or lack of touch. So does anybody want to kick off with the conversation?
Who's going to go for it? Were there any particular provocations from the first one that you're sort of curious to hear more about?
I was really interested in, I can't remember who said it, talking about imagination. I think it was it Rosie talking about imagination, Rosie Lee, and that sort of, it really interested me because one of my practices is the Feldenkrais method, and there are two parts to the Feldenkrais method. One is a group class where people are together in a space, lying on the floor and led by the teacher, the practitioner, and the other is functional integration where it's a one-on-one, which is very much a touch practice. And I was thinking about, I have been, of course, all through this lockdown, about, what are people doing? How's it affecting their practice as full-time Feldenkrais practitioners? And one of the things that we use in the awareness through movement, which is not a hands-on practice generally in the group class, is imagination. And going through a series of imagine you are doing this and imagine you are doing that, and not imagine touching and being touched, but I sort of began to think about those connections across practices, and I think Skinner releasing technique is also uses imagination quite a lot, and probably many of us as practitioners use imagination. So that was something that really interested me.
Yeah, I was also thinking about alternatives to touch as well, because touch is used a lot in the different projects I'm doing. But, there's one that's called Sensing the City. And actually I was realizing that touch is happening all the time. So if you walk through a city space when you're allowed now, things like gradient or the air, or, there's different qualities of touch happening all the time anyway. So in a moment where people might feel a sense of losing and that physical contact, just that reminder that we're always being touched all the time. And then I was watching a video this morning from one of the workshops I was doing, which is around dance and chronic pain or persistent pain. And someone was talking about how touch releases different things like oxytocin or endogenous opioids. So opioids that actually come from the body through things like touch. But they were also saying that actually comes not just out of the physical contact, but it can be just being in a group moving. So that could be socially distant. And things like singing. So the vibration of, vibration is touching you all the time through sounds as well. So yeah, that was some of the kind of alternative ways I was thinking about being touched as well.
I mean, there is this there's the most recent research of a colleague of mine from a German university, Gerko Egert, and he's talking about touch, but not only touching like in a literal sense, so you touch a body skin to skin, but also all the possibilities. So how could touch in terms of transmitting of affect, of emotion be possible, or what other concepts are there that are not only involving the skin-to-skin touch, but also the whole question of what does proximity mean? How do you convey touch, or how is it to be touched? I mean, being touched by something, which has, again, another meaning to this idea of touch. And I find this pretty interesting because this seems to be also very important these days. And I had to remember, because Sara, you were talking about the imagination and working with imagination in many of these body practices. I mean, body mind centering as well is so much drawing from imagination. And I had to think from the first conversation, Kate, you said that in your imagination, or no, you rather said in your memory, there is certain memories and sensations of touch are being amplified. And I also had to think about, in terms of, okay, we say touch, there are different proximities, there's this imagination. And what does our bodies also do, for instance, when we are outside? And I mean, I really very well remember this, or I experience right now this feeling that to some extent the body can't expand in the way it usually expands when you're outside, or this is what I'm feeling. So you're constantly sort of micromanaging your body in a way that it's a bit like the difference between winter and summer. In summer, you feel I can expand, I can flow. And in winter, you always feel like tight and compressed. And it's interesting that it's sort of the same feeling, that it's not only the avoidance of touch, but also having to keep your distance. But I also have the impression that sort of it's almost a feeling that as if you contract your body the whole time and you shrink your body. So also encapsulating yourself. So I have the impression it sometimes goes even further. And this may be something that as time goes by, and we perhaps, well, I don't know whether that's a good thing, whether we're perhaps getting used to this kind of new mode of social distancing, whether we're more relaxed with this. And whether this is good is the other question. But I find this as a sensation pretty interesting at the moment.
I think that's super interesting, and kind of in contrast to the original conversation around, I think we were all agreeing about this socially distant choreography, this accidental choreography that happens with the 2 meters apart. But actually, it's interesting to think about that in choreographic terms, that what you're proposing is almost that rather than relating to each other, our sense of solo is becoming amplified. So which is actually really interesting in terms of dance. I think one thing, when you all responded to the idea of imagination or the other senses, it made me wonder whether as a research area or a sector or an industry that we somehow take touch for granted. And I wonder what the opportunity is in this to broaden our sense of how we use touch. I mean, Sara, I'm really interested in how we draw on other practices that don't kind of, because I think my panic was, how can I do, because my form is so much based on touch. So I think there's an opportunity to borrow or lean into other practices that have been doing this before, I suppose. That's more of a comment. I don't know if anyone has any comments about the opportunities of this situation.
But I also think, because I was thinking it partly relates to a project I've been involved with Wriggle Dance Theatre, who make work for children, it's been a 2-year project on touch, working with a professor of psychology at Warwick University, Satoru Kita, and some of the people that we've been working with, touch is not such a comfortable thing. So I think one of the opportunities for me is maybe being able to understand that a bit more in a situation where I'm not in a context where, outside of the home anyway, where touch is now socially acceptable or even allowable, and how for some people that is a normal context, that it is, we presume that touch is something that is acceptable and is allowable between us, or we maybe don't presume, but I mean, I think it may be easy to presume that, but it's not necessarily the case. It's not always. Okay, so for me, that's a sort of opportunity to actually be able to maybe understand that a bit more for someone who is very touchy-feely and used to being in places where I can be like that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think it came up on the last one as well about culturally the different kinds of touch that feel more or less comfortable to people. You know, and yeah, at a point where you cannot necessarily touch people. Sometimes a certain kind of relief that you don't need to negotiate that, you know, anymore. So yeah, that's quite interesting.
I think the maybe you sort of touched a bit on this, Susanne. You know, for me also that's that feeling of the internal and the external. So often we reach to touch something or somebody, so we're going outward, very much away from ourselves. And then there's also that sense of how in some of the practices that we engage in somatic-based practice, we're very much going more inwards and inside ourselves. So there's those two things that are playing with each other, I think, and more outward touch is something that we are being more careful about and more aware of, as you're saying, in the choreography. I mean, I was very taken with that idea of the choreography and had really noticed how people are moving in a much smaller space within a bigger space, but also coming back to that thing of, you know, that is more about the external. And I think I've read a bit of I think it's Matthew Fulkerson, The First Sense, where he talks about this, and he talks about it's well known, touch being the first sense that develops in utero, which is both, it's sort of a bringing together of those two things. It's both an internal, because the unborn child is inside the womb, inside the mother, but it's also partly external to them because they are reaching out and touching. And I think that play between the internal and the external is really interesting, and in relation to being more isolated and guarding the way we behave and the way we touch.
It's interesting that you talk about inside and outside, and about embryonal development, because actually, and I think this is Didier Anzieux who's talking about this, says there are these various modes of development of the fetus. And I think it's, I always mix it up. It's either ecto or endoderm, don't ask me. So, but the interesting thing is that one of these, I think it's the endoderm, it's actually sort of responsible in the development for both the skin on the outside of the body and the brain. So there is a direct connection. And I find this really interesting, because then of course the skin, which is sort of you could say the primary medium of touch, is not only sort of the primary medium reaching outside, but it's also sort of deeply connected to, on one hand, the senses, the haptic sense, but also the whole issue that is going on in your brain, like thinking, but then also emotions sort of being transmitted via this touching into the brain, being developed and worked on there. And I think this is also what makes this idea of touch so important and so interesting, that it's not only about I reach out to someone, I touch the person, I feel the warmth of the skin, but there is so much more about it. Also these days culturally, I mean, we also, like in Germany, we have like huge debates that are blown up into media when one politician again steps over the border, and even though everyone's saying keep your distance, there's now one guy from the Liberal Democrats yesterday who hugged someone, but like a couple of days before, actually blaming people doing so. And then of course everyone's on him. And it's so sad also that, of course, it's necessary, the social distance, but it's also sad that touch also all of a sudden becomes a mode of, becomes a blame game. And on the other hand, and we had this in the first conversation already, and Simon, I think also Rosie brought this up, that it's, of course, touch always already has the other side of violence, of brutality, and so on. And sort of this now reflects back so much that all of a sudden touch also gets into this realm of violence, of blame, of forbiddenness, and all these ethical issues around it.
Yeah, something that you were saying there prompted me as well about the complexity of delineating what's considered internal or external.
Yes.
And you know, I'm trying to write a chapter at the moment for the Sensing the City project, and so, you know, reading about the different senses and experiences of interoception, so what might be considered attention to body systems, and exteroception, you know, awareness of the space around me, proprioception, awareness of movement through space, and then perception and how all of those things interact. And then, you know, just realizing in a kind of scientific sense, you try to separate things out so you understand them. But in practice, when I was trying to come up with examples of each of those things, it really wasn't so easy to separate them out, or at what point the different senses come in. And of course, then senses being really, you know, things that are understood differently across different cultures. So I just thought as well, an interesting part of the dance perspective is how we see things as interrelated and interconnected, as you were saying, bringing the kind of what's considered outside in and the other way around, instead of seeing human beings as delineated. So, you know, separating touch from another sense or something. So there was something about that interconnected, seeing the whole person in its context, as connected, as something I thought dance can contribute as well, you know. Yeah.
And of course, they, you know, sounded very binary in the way I was talking. I always think about that diagram, the sort of Mobius band, you know, that takes that starts on the inside, goes outside, goes back inside. That it is continuous, and it is a non-delineated way of being. Of course, it's in terms of touch and how we sense. Yeah, it's immediately. I'm thinking I've got the wall right there by me, and immediately I put my hand on it. Then so many things happen. I feel that surface. I feel the texture of it, but also it's transmitted through my arm into my shoulder, into my chest, into my thought. Immediately it's completely integrated. So that separation is academic, I suppose, in a way.
I think it is academic. You're right. Although I would also rather go with phenomenology and having this idea that the body is always already entangled, you could say, in the environment and in the outside, and that the outside is reflecting back the inside, reflecting back the outside. So that I would absolutely go with this. What I find really interesting, and that would be worth thinking about, is, so do we sort of now in these times, is there a certain kind of backlash into inside and outside? Because certain modes of touch aren't just possible. I mean, not only people, but also things. You go to the supermarket, you take a carrier bag, carrier bag or this little trolley, so you don't know, can I touch it or should I wipe it? So all these connections we usually make just naturally with our environment, all of a sudden there's sort of a no-go, or you should be careful. And then I'm asking myself, oh wow, so are we sort of propelled back into this odd binaries that we're constantly actually fighting for and constantly promoting to be overcome actually in our work?
Yeah. And I had another question that was coming up for me recently, is what is the place of my research now, you know? And I'd say that's probably happening for a lot of dance researchers. You know, for example, in the Sense in the City project, it was all based around moving through outdoor spaces, sensing what a place felt like, how it was experienced, touching, being close proximity to things and people passing through to come and understand the space. And then I was suddenly like, oh, what do I do now with that? You know, what happens next? And I suppose it takes time to sort of recalibrate your position and start to think, well, I suppose there's value, like people said in the last video, around understanding how people move through space. But also, I suppose, yeah, coming to terms with the aftermath as well. What happens when people come out of this? What does it feel like to readjust? Yeah, so I don't know if anyone else has answers to how they will deal with that in their research as well.
Well, I'm just thinking about the actual practice as well, and I haven't had this conversation with any Feldenkrais colleagues as yet. We're having a get together in very early June to discuss various things, and touch is going to be one of those. So I sort of think, well, what happens to all of those practices which are hands-on, and many yoga practices as well, in terms of teaching hands-on. And I've been continuing my yoga practice with my yoga teacher who lives in Devon, who I can't normally get to, but I can get to now, you know, twice a week online. And it's really interesting to see how she's very beautifully translating some of those things where she would use her hands to speak, if you like, on my body, on the other bodies that are in the class. And she's doing it very well and very successfully. But there's also that, you know, that sense of loss. And I wonder how we deal with that sense of loss when we come out of this, because actually, you know, am I going to put on my gloves and my mask when I do a functional integration session with somebody? And how will that be? Do they also wear gloves and a mask? And you know, is it still worth doing if you do those things, if you put this mask on, if you put gloves on? Or do we not do that at all? We actually do, you know, do the distanced practice, which can be done in awareness through movement sessions, where if you have a big space and people are lying a long way apart. But there is such a sense of, for me, and I think for many people, not just a sense of loss in relation to touch between friends and, you know, the way we naturally meet and greet and hug each other, but also through our practices, through things like contact and in dance practice. How do we deal with that loss, and what are the remnants of this period of lockdown?
We're on 22 minutes, so I don't know, Emma or Susanna, if you want to respond to Sara, and then I think we can keep going for a couple more minutes if you have any responses to that.
Yeah, not really, just briefly. I mean, my research is in a slightly other area, which at the moment one part is on choreography and protest. And of course, that's also interesting because not so much, there is protest happening, but more in the realm of being forbidden or not okay, or there are certain protests that are possible with social distancing. So again, without touch, although you don't necessarily touch during a protest, but the more people are there and the more they form a kind of mass, sort of touch comes quite naturally, which is also a big and important picture, that there are a lot of people that sort of rub against each other and touch and fight for something. Of course, that's not possible at the moment. On the other hand, we have this big issue of protests that aren't allowed, where people deliberately go beyond social distancing, assignments, they don't wear masks and so on. So again, we have another idea of touch or actually violating certain kinds of rules. Yeah. And that again, that is, for me, it's interesting to look into this. Yeah. But then again, I don't have to do this protesting practice. I mean, I have sort of the comfortable position of an outsider watching and observing. Yeah. But still, of course, it totally alters certain paradigms. You also have to look into what people are now doing in terms of online protesting, finding other means to express their concerns, which is also interesting, and which goes a bit beyond what we're talking about right now, where you also think, okay, is this as effective other than lots of people on the streets and so on and so on? So what does all of this mean? Yeah.
Yeah. I suppose just one last thing. I know it came up the last time as well around the different qualities of touch in terms of like medical contexts. And that came up as well in this pain project I'm doing. So, you know, I just had an exchange with a physiotherapist who was talking about the different kinds of touch so he has in his head the map of the anatomy, and he's feeling, and he feels for what's wrong. And then he was really curious to find this different way of touching that we were exploring. So some people were calling it receiving touch or listening touch, to see what you can find out with the hands that isn't necessarily based on anatomy, but finding out something about how that person feels. So that at the moment is not going to be possible. And I feel like there's some important exchanges that still could happen, exploring qualities of touch from different disciplines. So I'm hoping that at some point in the distant future we can re-engage with that exploration. Yeah.
That feels like quite a good point to maybe bring it to a natural conclusion. Thank you all for a really interesting conversation. So it's been lovely to see you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.